All right, well, thank you so much, Felicia, and thank you everyone who's joining me today. In this hour class, I'm going to show you how to do 4 different designs using the wonderful wooden crates that Michaels carries and some, well, just some basic stuff like paint and some more interesting stuff like leather to transform them into things that can be customized, look very high end, and just create some really interesting storage for your home because I don't know about you, but I always need more storage, and if it could look nice, that would be really good too. And leather is a wonderful material for something like this because it is not only very, it can be very beautiful and can look very sort of upscale, but also because it is a very tough material, it is practical to use for actually usable handles and things like that. So it's not just decorative, it can actually be handy to sort of give these crates as many options in how you hold them as and how you might be able to use them as possible. So the leather that I'm going to be using in this for mixed in with the different crate designs is, here's a scrap piece of it. I'm also using some black and then some that is embossed that has a turquoise color to it. You'll notice this leather's fairly thick. You can kind of see it's really almost maybe almost an eighth of an inch. You could use other leather for these projects, absolutely. There are so many options. This kind of leather in particular, it has kind of a, it's almost matte. It looks a little bit vintage, and I really liked it, so I picked it for that. But as long as you're, if you want to make handles that you can use, as long as you're using leather that's got some heft to it, so it won't be too fragile, you could pick anything. You could pick ones with different textures, ones with sort of suede-y textures. You could mix textures. There's a lot of colors out there, and me and the people from Silver Creek just want you to have a chance to see what all of your options are because it's a really exciting material to kind of bring into your crafting domain. I'm going to switch my camera so we can look down at what we're doing. Here we go. And if you're wondering about the foot of my camera stand, because the crates are kind of tall, I have to set it on the floor. So that was just how we ended up having to set it up. So I'm going to be showing you 4 different designs. 3 of them are the ends of the crates. This is one. You can see I did these ones as samples, so they're all different on every side. This is 2. This one is number 3. And then, and this turquoise one is number 4, which shows the side of the crate. So as you can probably guess, an hour is not very long for going over, 4 designs like this that all have a lot going on in them. So I am going to be moving at a pretty good clip between steps, and there are a lot of sections of these steps that I won't be going through in the class. I'll just be kind of going over what I did, just because if I went through all of them start to finish, it would be impossible to get through all these designs. You would probably just watch me do one. But as Felicia said, this class is being recorded, and it is also, I have written and illustrated instructions for you. So between all of those, I think, you can rewatch and you'll be able to get all the information you need. I have pre-cut all my leather pieces. You will see if you download the instructions that for the crate pieces that are cut out of the 8.5 by 11 pieces of leather, I showed you the layout that I found to give you the best sort of use of as much of your leather as possible. So you don't get a lot of waste. So you'll see them in there. So I'm gonna this is the finished guy, so I'm gonna put it off to the side. So I've got this one that's already been painted, but of course you ask, like, what about the painting part? Wouldn't it be great to see that? And I am going to show you that kind of briefly, but on another piece of wood, because I just didn't want to be buried in about, layer of 15 different crates here. So to get this effect, this kind of sunsetty, sort of pretty pastel effect, the first thing that I did, which I pre-did on this piece of wood, which is just representing the end of the crate for us, is I took the chocolate brown paint and thinned it out a bit with water, and I just brushed that over, and really let it. Sorry, I'm just adjusting the camera. There we go. Really let it soak in there and just darken the wood a little bit, because I really like things to have a bit of a vintage or kind of an aged look to them. I just think that always looks really interesting. And if you start with a darker background color, and you brush lighter colors on top of it, then you'll get that. So as we go, I'm using this undercoat a couple times in a couple of the different crates. And if you want it to look even more sort of antique or more a little darker in color, then you just need to use more of the either a darker brown or just more coats of it, because the darker you start with, the more kind of antique it will look. So with this crate, which I've been thinking of as my daughter's crate, because as soon as she saw the cat, she said, "That one's mine, right? I get to keep it," because cats are her favorite thing. For this color, this painting on the end, I'm using 3 colors in my Lazy Person's palette there. I've got, well, I don't remember the exact color names, but they are on the material list. But I've got a sort of violet pink color, white, and yellow. And of course, this is all a very loose painting, so you could do it with any colors, and you could do it almost any way, and there's really no way to mess it up. I've got my large paintbrush here, and the important thing right now is that it is totally dry. I want it to be completely dry. I don't want to dilute the paint like I did with the brown, because I really want it to just sort of brush on a little more of a dry brush technique that'll give us a little more texture. So first I'm going to grab just a bunch of this pink, and I want to spread it out in the bristles just a little bit. Oh, and I just splopped some onto my wood, but that's fine. That's the nice thing about doing these things that are a little more random. So I've got quite a bit of paint on there, and I just, starting at the top and going down, I want to start just brushing kind of randomly. I don't want perfect coverage. I want that texture. So make sure you kind of start from different sides, because you tend to get more paint at the beginning of the brush stroke, obviously. And then I'm going to let this fade out just a bit as it gets down to the bottom. And of course, if I want more pink, I can keep adding it on. And I can keep adding it if I want to really cover most of this brown and just have little hints of it peeking out, I can do that. You can also sand the paint after it dries, if you find that maybe you ended up with a little bit too much paint. And then you can kind of make it look a little bit more antiqued, or sort of control the amount of color you have on there. So I'm just sort of going to keep doing this until it looks pretty good, but I really want to let it fade out toward the bottom. And I can always put more pink on after. So now I'm going to wipe off my brush. In a perfect world, I would probably wash it out at this point, but you gotta keep on moving. So we're just going to see how it goes in a normal world. But you know what, these colors will look nice if they're mixed too, so it doesn't really matter. Grabbing some of the yellow now. I'm basically going to do the same thing, but I'm coming from the bottom. And it's fine. You can either let your pink really dry, or I kind of just did this right away, so they sort of blend together. And I'm using a lot of yellow right now, a little bit more than I used on my actual crate. So this has got a bit more contrast, a little more texture to it. And I like that. It's a nice thing about this kind of painting is there's really no way to have something that that isn't going to look nice. Well, now I've got yellow all over all of it. Well, as you can see, this kind of process, I think anyone who paints knows that sometimes you just sort of get into it and you keep adding paint until you're happy with it. But if I just a little pink to the bottom, there we go. And then if you want even more texture, I've also got white, which you can try to pick it up and kind of not mix it in as you're doing the other colors, but I think it's kind of easier to put on by itself. But I'm just grabbing, and I'm off camera for some of this. I'm grabbing some of the white. I don't want quite as much because I don't want it to take over the other colors. I just want it to be a little bit thinner. So I'm just gonna wipe my brush a tiny bit and just brush it really lightly over the top. And that just gives some little streaks of kind of white there in random places. And that is essentially how I did that end. With this kind of painting, I mean, you can have more colors than that. You can have fewer. You could obviously have any colors. You could do a solid background. It wouldn't matter. But I just kind of liked this sort of sunsetty abstract texture. And of course, it's pretty shiny right now because it's not dry. But I'm going to move that out of the way. Little magic of television, swap out. So then we pretend that this is what I just did. So with this crate, the pieces that I have to deal with now are, I've got the tail, essentially, tail of the cat, which is a strap. It also functions as a strap. And I have cat's head, cat's back, and I thought I lost these right before we started, which would have been kind of sad. I have the pupils of the eyes. And you will find when you cut out this leather, whether you cut it with, I know I listed both cutting utility blade and also, you know, if you have like a sturdy pair of scissors, you'll be amazed by how easy it is to cut, even with these kind of, you know, finicky designs with lots of little curves. It really is easier than you think. You don't need special tools for that. And even with the scissors, it's pretty easy. So I've already got 2 guide holes for my screws drilled in there. And in the written instructions, there are really detailed images that show you exactly where all these holes need to go. And I have my pieces, like I said, all pre-cut out. This tail's got 2 holes in it for the screws. And just to show you, because I don't really have time to show all of them, but this is the what the leather hole punch looks like. Also a very handy tool. So for the purpose of this, you just kind of pick one of the middle-sized ones, one that will be big enough for the screws to go through, and just punch. And it's actually quite easy to do too. So the easiest way to do this design is to start first by screwing down the tail, because then you can match up everything else along with it before these pieces get glued down. So I've just got I've got wood screws. I wish I could have found ones that were a tiny bit shorter than these, because when putting stuff on the side of the crates, I did find that the points went through a little bit. But if that happens, I also figured out if you just cut little pieces of the leather out, you can glue them over those little points that are sticking through the wood, just so you don't have to worry about it catching anybody, or especially if like you're making this for your kid. We don't want any dangers. So I just stuck the screw through the leather just to make it a little bit easier. I'm putting it upright. And these screws are a little bright. They don't really match with our color scheme. Let me tighten that a little bit. Whoa. But they you can find, you know, bronze colored or antique brass colored screws, or in my in the other version that I showed you a minute ago, I used a Sharpie to darken the heads of the screws. You could also, if you wanted, like glue little, you know, little round pieces of leather over them if you really wanted to cover them completely. All right, get that lined up, and this is at a slight angle, so I'm going to have that one be at a slight angle too. There you go. And the nice thing about this handle is that with it screwed down, it's very usable. I mean, you could absolutely pick this up from this handle, but it also doesn't stop you from using this handle if for some reason you need it to. You can reach both quite easily. And if you had this, you know, pushed onto a shelf or something, this is nice because it's easy to grab it to pull it out. So now the rest of this is just going to be done with glue. I'm using Fiebing's Leathercraft cement. So it's a glue that's specifically for leather. It's formulated to work really well on, you know, leather is kind of porous and it's also flexible. So, you know, you need a good glue to be able to use it for the most different types of things. You could use another glue. if there's another one you really prefer, but this is a very good glue for leather. So what we want to get on here is just a generous amount of it. And I know it's horrible, but I always use my fingers. And the goal is kind of similar to how you would use many white glues, is that we want a nice coating along the whole back of it, right, the fuzzy side, if you're wondering which side's the back. Although you could glue it the other way if you prefer the look of the fuzzy side. We want to make sure to get all the way to the edges so that they won't, they don't get too dry and then they end up not sticking and peeling up later. But you don't want so much excess glue that it is pushing out or getting everywhere, because this isn't a kind of glue where a bunch of extra will help you. There's no reason. So we just want a nice even coating. And it doesn't dry super, super fast, but you do want to, wipe my finger off. You do want to move fairly quickly. So now that I've got the tail down, the reason I'm doing the back first is because then I can just line it up so that it looks right. So that this space is kind of even. Press that down, and that's all I need to do. I also want to put a tiny bit of glue right on the end of here of the tail. It's not holding it up for the purpose of the strap itself. The screws are doing that work, because I would not count on glue if you're going to be actually, lifting the crate from the strap, but it'll just keep this end sticking down so that it'll look nice and neat. And you'll find it sticks very quickly. So just press it down and give it a nice smoothing out. So I think it would be a bit of a overkill to make you watch me glue the rest of the cat's face, because you can see it's more of the same. You just want to line it up, put the glue on, and then kind of line it up so you like how it looks and the spacing looks good. One thing I do want to encourage is it's pretty fun to play with where you put the pupils of the eyes. My daughter had a lot of fun playing with that. You can make it kind of looking way up to the side. You can make it cross-eyed if you want. You can be looking down. Or alternately, if you don't want to deal with gluing down these little pieces, you could paint a pupil and put like even maybe a more realistic eye in there. And I chose a cat because I love cats, but you could absolutely do different animals. I think that there are quite a few different animals that this pattern could be adapted for. You would just need to figure out, if they don't have a long tail, you might need to figure out something else for that strap. But I think that gives you a lot of cute options, especially for a kid's room. All right, I'm gonna push this guy off to the side. Hopefully without knocking my camera down. Ooh. Move on to number 2. The second crate design I'm going to show you, this is a finished version. And excuse the dust. I keep having to turn them over because they're different on each side. But I think of this as the pirate crate. I think I have it listed as the compass crate on the instructions. And for this, instead of paint, we are using a Sharpie for this part. Always useful. And a Fiebing's vintage gel, which it's another product that is specifically for leather, but you can use it for a lot of other things. Actually, leather dyes and leather, these kind of antique or vintage gels like this can work really amazing on wood. It sinks into the wood, and it acts very similarly to if you were using like a wood stain. But the nice thing is you can thin it with water. It's not stinky. It's not something where you're going to have to open all your windows to use. It's easy to clean up. So I really like it. And it gives it that transparent look where you can see the wood through the outside. So you can see for this one, I used black leather, but it is the same. It's the same type as the brown. And it comes in both these 1.5-inch straps and also the 8.5 by 11 sheets. Which is very handy. For this, we used one of the sheets because you could cut out like all of this stuff just from the one. So let me move that guy off to the side. Ugh. And you will notice, obviously, part of this one has been done. But again, I need to show you that. So Let me just grab my other handy piece of example wood over here. So on this piece, and you'll kind of just have to ignore that rather dark stripe through the middle, but the crates, some of them have really neat markings on them and knot holes and stuff. And I think that's something that's fun to sort of play into. So I still think this is a good representation of how it will look. So as part of the templates that you can download, there is this was the original one I drew, which is why this piece of paper looks kind of ratty, but is the template for this compass rose. The easiest thing to do in terms of transferring it will be to trace it. If you have transfer paper, like the graphite transfer paper, that works great. I did sort of the lazy person's or the I don't want to go to the store transfer paper. So I coated the back of it with pencil, stuck it down on the front of the crate, obviously. You just need to kind of get it centered and then just trace over. And so you can see it's quite light, but I can see it. It probably doesn't show on camera as well, actually. But once that is done, here's where we break out the Sharpie. And I'm not going to outline this entire thing right now because you don't actually need to see me do that entire thing. But I do want to show you just because you will notice that as you go over the lines, you will probably get some spread of the ink. Particularly, I found if I sanded, and I do suggest doing a little sanding of like the corners and stuff of these crates before you start. I did include sanding blocks just because they are handy, and then we'll also be using one with this. But depending on how smooth the end of the crate is, you may get some kind of spreading. Oh, that wasn't neat. Spreading of the ink a little bit as you go. You can kind of maybe see it right there. But don't worry about that because it really won't show in your final piece. And also, if you're having trouble having a steady hand, which honestly, some of my lines here, they're wibble wobbling all over the place. Don't worry about that either. As long as you're more or less on target. It's just getting worse the more I talk about it. As long as you're more or less on target, oh, Lord, which this is a good example. I'm cursing myself as I speak. I promise you that it will look fine because handily enough, the second thing that we're going to do after this, assuming you want to have the whole thing traced out, in a perfect world, I would probably wait a couple minutes just to give the ink a little bit more of a chance to dry. But this will be fine too. So the sanding pads that I included in the supply list, they're really great for smoothing out like the edges and stuff of the crates or just any rough spots that you might want to kind of perfect. But they're also really good for some of these color effects. So if either I hate my compass or maybe I don't hate it, but maybe I just really want it to look antique, like those antique wine boxes where the logos are barely showing. What do I do? So I've got my sanding pad, and it's like a medium. I'm not sure what exact grit it is, but I'm gonna sand over my pattern. And you may also, especially if you don't wait as long for the marker to dry, you may get a little bit of a gray kind of, it's almost like it's spreading over the wood. And you can actually kind of see it. And what it is it's just the wood dust from the sanding, but it's got some of that Sharpie in it because we're sanding off the Sharpie. You can see it there. But don't worry about that because if you just lightly kind of wipe that off with a paper towel before doing the next step, and I'll show you, it does wipe off. But you can sand it basically as much or as little as you want. So I messed up right there. So that would probably be a good place for me to take off, a little more of the marker. And if you have some parts of it that are more faded out than others, that'll actually add a lot to it sort of antique look. So you don't even need to try to get it consistent. Sort of having some inconsistency will actually make it look cooler for this. But if you have a part you don't like, feel free to sand that part almost all the way off, because that's kind of the it's kind of the convenience of doing this. Is it's easy to do that and no one will even know. Oops, I got tipped to the side. All right, so I've got just a piece of dry paper towel. I'm just wiping off that. You can see that gray dust that kind of got on there. So you can see it does come off. So don't worry as you start sanding that you're getting that on there and it's gonna ruin everything. So once you have your compass on here and then you've sanded it to your satisfaction, so we're using this vintage gel. So, and if you have someone in your life who likes to eat yogurt, say these are really, really handy for mixing things. I'm gonna open this, hopefully without it exploding on me. There we go. And this is tan, so it's got this really nice kind of golden, almost a golden oak kind of color to it. It's definitely like a gel. I mean, you can see how thick it is. And you can brush it on as is, like just where it's at in terms of thickness. Or you can, I think in the instructions, I did say to put a bit of water in there. And I am in just a second. Let me wash this out really quick. It does make it easier, especially the first your first kind of go over, to add some water to it to thin it out. I'm not trying to get it to be completely thin. I mean, completely liquid necessarily, unless you specifically want a very light color. But I just added enough water to sort of get it moving. So now when I kind of move this, it moves with it. It's not just a solid stuff. If you're worried about how dark it's going to get, then just dilute it a little more to start. And I would be using probably a larger brush than this, but my other one, the pink paint just won't come out of it. So, but that's the handy thing about a brush set. You always have another brush. So if this was the front of the crate, obviously, you just want to brush this onto it. It does sink into the wood, but it doesn't sink in like instantly. So if you just brush some of it on and then wipe off the excess, you'll find that any sort of lines or brush marks smooth out very, very nicely. So you don't really need to worry about that. And you just kind of get one coat on, and you will want to wipe off the excess as you go, because there's a certain amount of it that just won't sink in. But then you can add additional coats if you want it darker, or you could always add a little bit of paint or something to darken it up. But it's got a really beautiful transparency to it. So you really get a sense that you're seeing that wood underneath, and it really plays it up. It also, because it is called a vintage gel, so one of the things it does is it gets darker in markings and things, because it's meant to make things look kind of old. And so if you've got any interesting knot holes or anything else on the crates, or like this particular crate kind of has some of this stuff happening on it, it really highlights that and makes it look really cool and just sort of old fashioned, and it has a lot of texture. So I've just wiped off the excess. I can still put more on, and you could put more on and even just put more on in certain spots. Like, so let's say you wanted the middle part to be a little bit darker, and then just leave it for a minute before you wipe it down, and it'll stay a little bit darker. And then if you do this and then you find that your compass, like maybe it's still darker than you prefer it to be, you can still sand it more at this point and then, put more of this on. I did that the first time because I was kind of playing back and forth with it. So you just let this dry, sand it, and then put some more of this on, and you can pretty much do that until you know that it is exactly what you wanted. So let me move this, swap this guy out again. Ugh, put it out of the way. So if we pretend this is the same one, and yes, I realized that when I did this, I should have probably put this piece on a little bit lower because it's covering up my south. But you can always cut this one thinner if you want, or just lower it down. I was in a bit of a hurry when I glued it. So the first step that I'm just going to tell you and not show you for in interest of time is that for the pattern template pieces for this crate, the compass crate, you have 4 pieces that are 3/4 of an inch wide and 9.5 inches long. And then you have one that's the same width and 11 inches long. And that's this bottom piece. The 4 pieces are these. So you've got 1, 2, 3, 4. And I pre-glued them down because you've already seen kind of how the glue works, and that just tends to take a lot of time. The easiest way to glue these down is to start with these side pieces and make sure that they line right up to the edge of that corner. And then you can glue down the front one so that they can sort of it can just lay over that edge and they can kind of butt up against each other in a neat way. And then it's easiest to glue this guy on last. So, but right now it looks kind of boring. It's got a lot more straps to go because this one I might have gone a little overboard with the straps. I was really going for kind of a pirate treasure chest look. And I really like this leather for it because it's not super shiny. It's got kind of a mellow glow to it, I guess. It's not like plasticky or anything. So it lends itself to sort of this, looks like something you might put treasure in. So these 4 pieces are the ones that go around the corners like this. Stack them up. Actually, I'll stack them out of the way. And I already have all these holes drilled. And again, you will find the kind of diagram for exactly where these holes need to go in the instructions. The other pieces are this longer strip, which is the handle, and then these 2 little guys. And what you need to do first, once these are all cut out, you've punched your holes, you've cut these little slits in them, which are shown on the template too. These 2 little ones need to be threaded through the slits in there. So they're kind of, the holes on them will be like just to the outside of that handle. And now is the fun part, which is screwing them all on. Let me grab my screwdriver. And this one has a lot of screws. I was also going a little wild with just the hardware because it sort of had a piratey look too. So I'm just sticking this through the hole, and then I've got it in the hole in the wood. Oops, sorry, bumped my head on my camera there. Whoa. And again, you can buy different metals. Made that one a little bit too tight. Hang on. You can buy screws in different metal finishes and stuff. For this one, I felt that actually the silver or steel color kind of worked. Man, how did I even do that? Hang on 1 second. And then also, if you have a tendency to put your screws in way too tight, you could have an actual screwdriver handy, which I did not. Okay, there we go. Okay. To be honest, when I did this the first time, I put the screws in by hand because I was a little bit worried about everything. Maybe it been going in too fast, or I don't know what I thought was going to happen, but it is a lot easier with the screwdriver. Now that I've got my ends on, straighten them out a little bit. We do it with the rest of them. And it is easier to do the main part of the strap first before you do on these little guys, because it's just easier to reach. Whoa. But you can see how it goes, and it'll hold that down and everything should match up fine. And don't worry, there's supposed to be some give here. It's not supposed to lay flat because then you wouldn't really be able to grab it very easily. So with the side pieces, you can see, well, here, I'll do the ones on this side, that they all go on the same way. So there's a hole here. So I want to screw this piece down. And that's why we have to do the gluing of the edges first, because obviously these need to go on over. And I did find that as opposed to measuring to place the hole on the side right here, ignore the fact this isn't all colored. I found it easier to actually get them screwed down on this side first. And these were pre-drilled, but and then just push it over like this and mark the hole that way, because it's a little bit hard to gauge exactly how much of that length you're sort of losing going around the corner. And I had marked one, and then it had ended up a little bit too like too far down, and then the leather wouldn't stretch. So it's a bit easier to just attach it in the front and then screw in the side one and lay that down. Yeah, and this is one of the spots where you may find, depending on how long the screws you're using are, that it does go through the wood just a little tiny bit. So again, what I said before is it works really well to just glue a little piece of leather over that. But that's basically how you finish it up. You just put the rest of these 4 sides on, and then it'll end up looking pretty much like this. I really like this one because it's got this cool knot hole right there. All right, let me shift this guy to the side. Yeah. I've got so many things stacked around me. All right. So now, number 3. This one is a little different. It's a little less, not so piratey. And it has a couple different sort of elements going on. Most of them about the same as the others, but not all. You know, we've got the strap, and it's screwed on in 2 places. And then these are not actually screws, although they may look like it from a distance. But they are what's called button studs. And I'll show you. They're really handy, and you just pop this over it. The nice thing about that is if you want to have a pretty little label on your crate, you could make multiple ones and swap them out. So I just have this frame. You can, with this leather, you can actually, if you have any leather stamps, I found that surprisingly enough, this leather actually does stamp pretty well. If you want to stamp, you know, someone's name, or, you know, you can write on them with like a paint pen or a metallic pen or anything like that. I think there are a lot of options. Oops, sorry. A lot of options, but I just like the idea that you could take this on and off and switch them out. So the pieces for this crate are cut from 2 things. One is I told you that this leather comes in 1.5 inch straps. So all these strap pieces are cut from that, because that's a lot less work. I have to cut them from the straps. And then these corner pieces, you'll see when you look at the instructions, are actually cut from the same sheet of brown leather that the cat pieces are cut from. There's plenty of space for them. And then these turquoise accent pieces come from this really cool trim leather. And this is another thing where you could use so many different things, because this one, it has that nice turquoise color. We've got, you know, some of this kind of floral embossed pattern that I think gives it a lot of interest. But there's a million things out there. There's metallic leather trim. You could put cheetah print. I mean, there's just different colors and textures. You could layer on shiny leather onto suede. Like, there's just so many things you can do. I really encourage you to look at Michael's and look in that section and just sort of let your mind roam. But we're also using a bit of this turquoise leather for the final one, the final design that's on the side of it. So you'll recognize it. So then for this, what I need to do is turn this guy over. Here we go. Okay. So you can see that I did already do the corners. I already glued, they're just glued on. And you could either just glue the brown parts on and then glue these on top of them, or glue them together and then glue them on. It doesn't really make any difference. And I have already drilled my 4 holes for the strap. So at this point, the main thing is this, how we do this. So I'm sure you'll be not surprised to learn that I have another piece of wood that I have prepped. I'm not going to be able to truly show you this because it involves some drying time that I don't have time for, but I did show it in a lot of detail in the instructions. So and hopefully that will be clear. And so what we're using for this one is some painter's tape. It's an inch wide. Also got, where are my colors? There we go. A new Lazy Person's palette. And then I have, this one is buttermilk, kind of a nice dark cream color. And then I have white. And then again, I used the brown, that kind of chocolate brown to darken the kind of diluted and to darken this on top. So I'm not going to be able to show you the taping because the paint underneath would have to be completely dry or it's just going to pull it up. But I will show you the just kind of the painting process for these. One second. Grab my brush. So just like with the first one with the cat, I want my brush to be dry because then I can kind of get on that paint will go on in a really textured way. So what you will do to get this stripe is first, you got a dry brush, and you could use the bigger brush. Again, I'm using the small one because my other one's just having trouble getting the pink paint out of it. But you could also use this. It doesn't matter. It's just a small brush, you'd get a little more texture. So I'm kind of brushing it around on my palette to work the paint into the bristles a little bit. And then again, I'm just doing kind of the same thing where I'm just brushing really lightly. I want it to go on unevenly. I don't want it to all be the same. And how thick you want this to be and how much or how little of the brown behind that you want to show is obviously completely up to you. You will find that the color looks brighter and kind of the color of the paint sitting on top of this brown looks very bright at first, but as it dries, a little bit more of the brown shows through. So just don't be surprised if you do a coat and then you're like, oh, it's darker than I thought. So it's worth letting it dry, and then you can really see what the colors are going to be. But you know, once you've done some of that, and if you don't like this if you don't like this amount of texture, we've got some very darker bits showing through. If you do just put, and you can't see me, but I am dipping my brush barely into my water, just so I have a little bit of moisture on the end of it. If you do want it to be just a little bit more even or a little more subtle, if you have just a tiny bit more moisture on your brush and a tiny bit of the paint, you can kind of just brush over and it'll put a little bit more of a diluted color over those darker areas without completely covering them up. But once you have the cream color to where you want it, and keep in mind that it's only showing through these little stripes, so don't let yourself, oh sorry, my auto contrast doing something. Don't let yourself get too obsessed. Hang on one second. I'm not sure what my camera is trying to do. Could I help it? Can I help you, camera? Oh. Okay, well, hopefully it will adjust itself in a moment. Once you have the cream to where you want it, the next thing you want to do is let that dry completely. even overnight, if you possibly could, because the paint has a tendency to pull up when you put the painting tape down, even when it is sort of a very relatively thin layer of paint here. And if a little bit of it does pull up, it's not the end of the world, but it's better to make sure you let this dry for, multiple hours in order to let it stay on there once you put the paint on. I'm so sorry. I'm just trying to, I don't know why my camera is doing this. Hopefully it will adjust itself. But the next thing that we want to do, hang on. I'm so sorry. I don't know why it's just suddenly spotlighting itself like crazy. There we go. Ugh, that is the problem, apparently. But once it is completely dry, you just want to put your pieces of this inch wide painter's tape. I mean, you could use a different color, but what I did is I just kind of lined up my tape with sort of centered it roughly with the gaps between the slats on the sides of the crate. So you can see they kind of just line up there. You could have more stripes or fewer, space them in a different way, but just get this, get the tape stuck down on those stripes really well. And then all you need to do is go back and basically just brush over with the pure white, the same way that you did with the cream. And again, just do it for as many coats as will get you kind of the amount of contrast you want. Especially if you've let a lot of that brown show through the cream color, it'll really help because you will get a lot of contrast. But even if it's more subtle, I think it would be very pretty no matter what. So you obviously for all of these, you want to let the paint or the color dry completely before you put on the straps. And if you do want to put a finish on these, which especially if you just want to lengthen their lives a little bit or help them be a little bit sturdier, more able to be cleaned off, for instance, like wiped off. You can put any kind of acrylic finish or any finish that you would normally put on wood or something that was painted should work just fine. But especially if you're going to use a spray finish, I would do it before you put on the straps, just so you don't, because you'll end up getting it on the leather, but only a little bit. I mean, you won't be able to control exactly where it goes. So the last things for this one are the straps, obviously. So I've got these two pieces. And on this strap, we've got 3 holes on each side. And in the middle hole is the 2 side holes are the ones where the screws are going to go. And then the middle hole is the one where the button stud is going to go. So it's a 2-piece thing. It's got this little kind of round button on the top, and then it's got a screw. You just thread that screw through and screw it down. And they are a kind of button. I mean, they're used on a lot of different things. You've probably seen them before at some point. But they're handy for this because it just puts a little extra thing that you can pop that on and off. And as of right now, I cannot remember if this is supposed to go this way or this way. But you know what? It doesn't really matter. So we're just going to screw this one down really quick. And you can see, and for, again, I've got diagrams on so hard to feel where it is in the wood, on the instructions that will show you exactly to the very specific measurements exactly where these holes need to go. So in a lot of ways, this one, and it looks a lot more complicated in terms of its straps and stuff than it actually is. And then it kind of just goes over the same way that these other straps you've been doing. Just make sure it loops over like this and it doesn't get twisted. this one down. I knew the screws would be the hardest part of this. Okay. There we go. And obviously the screws need to go on the bottom too, but I think you've definitely gotten the idea of how that works. But on the diagram, one thing that may not be completely clear is that for the holes on this piece, this sort of little banner label piece, you'll see like little lines on either side of the hole, and you just want to cut those. They just need to come out just the tiniest bit, and they're what helps it pop over that the round top of the button stud. There we go. And then kind of close around it. There are special punches for buttonhole punches that will have like one slit on one side, but you can just cut them with a blade if you want to. And then you can swap out your labels to your heart's content. All right, and I think we have just enough time to do this last one. And if I can get my, 1 second. I do not know what is going on with the camera. Just want to be closer. Oh, well, okay, hopefully that stays. So this is the one pattern that's on the side of the crate instead of the end. Let me grab its pieces. And despite the fact that it looks kind of, I'd say looks kind of complicated, it actually is probably the simplest of all of them. And I think at this point you could probably guess how I did this. So there's some brown on there first. And then I used the turquoise paint. And what I did is just in the same way that I've been showing you with all the other ones, I brushed more thickly along these two of the slats. And then with these two, I kind of waited until I'd already done these and I had barely any paint, just a little bit of the turquoise left on my brush. And then again, I just grabbed a little water to dilute it a bit. And so I basically just brushed very diluted turquoise over these ones. So they just have a little hint of it without totally covering the brown. And depending on how much contrast you want to have, you could certainly, you could just leave these brown. You could have these be solid turquoise, doesn't matter. I was going for kind of a continuing on of that little more aged antique theme. So let me flip this guy over. The other side. All right, so I know we are almost done, but the nice thing about this one is it's actually incredibly simple. So I'm just going to show you on one side, but I have these 4 holes drilled already. And I've got my strap, which has 2 holes on each end. And then those holes have little slits cut on either side. And that's for those small turquoise pieces to kind of thread through. But you cannot do that until after you screw it down, just because of how it goes together. Honestly, screwing down the straps is probably one of the most fun parts, because then you go from a big pile of things that are almost done to something that is done very quickly. Oh, except when it does that noise. Okay, so, and then I'm going to put one more screw in here so it stays down. And again, if you're dealing with just decorative straps or something, there's other things that you could use. I mean, there's like furniture tacks and decorative sort of little decorative rivets and things. But if you plan to be actually using the strap, like using it, picking the crate up by it, then I highly recommend to screw down the leather, because that's really the only thing that's going to truly give you the sturdiness. So then I've got these four little pieces of that embossed turquoise leather. So my goal with this design was basically to cover the screws, because this is my last one of the 4 and I kind of got tired of seeing them. So what you want to do once this is securely screwed down is thread one of these through each one. So go under, over the screw, under again. You get the idea. And they, oh, well, I haven't glued that one down yet, or screwed it down. And they do actually stay surprisingly well, just sort of sitting like this. But I think they look a lot better glued down. But this is another place, kind of like on the cat's tail, where you kind of have to glue it while it's in place. Like, you really, really, I assure you, do not want to try to put glue on these ends and then thread it through. It's messy and it didn't work. And it's not worth it. So it's better to just thread these through and then just kind of fold it back. Put a little bit of that leather cement on there, and just especially to make sure you get all the way to the edge on the end so that that'll stay down. You don't need to try to get all the way back under. It's really just get the glue on the part of this little strap that's sticking out. And I think it makes it look a lot classier than just having a bunch of exposed screws on there. And again, this is something that you could use a design like this to combine lots of different textures, different colors, different surfaces, and you can combine it with a different painting. I think there's really just no end to the options that you have for whatever theme your house has or whatever look you're going for. And it'll look like you spent a lot more money than you actually did, which I think we can all agree is always a good feeling. I'm going to turn this one over so you can see the finished one as we finish up. There we go. It's got all its pieces. And I think that's it, unless I forgot anything big.
I don't think so. Thank you for teaching, Annie.
Thank you so much. Oops. I keep trying to straighten it and I'm making it worse. There we go.
Hey, Annie, was there anything else you're gonna say, or was you gonna turn your camera back to
Oh,
you?
yeah, sorry. I was just trying to
I
get
want to
it
make
it.
sure.
Yep. There we go.
All right.
Well, thank you everyone for joining me on this very brisk ride through a lot of patterns. But I'm sure, you're all crafters. You got it. I'm sure you'll be able to take these and run with them and go places that I never thought of.
Well, awesome. Thank you everyone for coming, and we hope to see you in the next class.
Thank
Bye.
you, everyone.